Hello again. Welcome back to the course Life of Christ. We're in class 35 today, and we're in a series of classes that look at Jesus and individuals in different ways. We talked about Jesus and Nicodemus. We talked about Jesus and the Samaritan woman. And in this class, we want to mention the story of Jesus and Zacchaeus. So if you go with me to Luke chapter 19, we'll read this short story. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." Great story. So let's look at a little bit of background for this story. First of all, some pictures of Jericho. You see this is a picture obviously taken in the 21st century. You have modern Jericho over this direction. Then you have Herod's palace, which is of Herod the Great. That was built back just before the birth of Jesus. And then you have what they call Tel es Sultan, which traditionally has been the place they've located as the conquest of Jericho in the story of Joshua 3 through 6 there. And then you see all around the desert, the Judean desert. You see Jericho itself is oasis, but around it, it's pure Judean desert. And this is the area where we've looked at before in a couple of other stories where Jesus was tempted. We had the story of the Good Samaritan that may have taken place in the Wadi Kilt. And then looking from the south north, it's kind of interesting that you can barely see the snow-capped peak of Mount Hermon. And Mount Hermon is at the very northern edge of Israel. And this is, 2/3 of the way down Israel from north to south. So you can tell it's not a very large country. It's interesting to have that perspective. And then again, a little bit different perspective. You see down Jericho down on the floor here of the valley, the Jordan Valley. And then you have the Tel, that is traditionally Old Jericho. And then what they call the Mount of Temptations, where they think might have been near the place where Jesus was tempted in the Judean desert. And then if you have kind of a panoramic shot, a little bit from the southwest, again, the different places, Herod's palace, the Tel, the Jordan River in the distance, looking over toward kind of east, northeast. And then you barely see the edge of the Dead Sea right over here. So you get an idea of this area as it was in the time of Jesus. And also the ministry of John the Baptist likely happened right around here. And Jesus was probably baptized in the Jordan River right about here, just north of where it went into the Dead Sea. So it's a place where several biblical events happened, interesting to look at. And then if you looked at it from the aerial view from the Mount of Temptation, then that's what it would look like. Now, in this story, you hear about Zacchaeus being so short, he had to climb a tree to be able to see Jesus as he went by. And this is a tree that the tour guides take you to, and they say this is a sycamore fig tree, a certain kind of fig tree, because not all fig trees are the same. And they like to point at it and say, this is the tree that Zacchaeus climbed. We know it's not that tree because this tree is only several hundred years old and not 2,000 years old. But it gives us a good visual for this story. Now, if you look at the story itself, some background again about Jericho in the time of Christ. In that time, Jericho was a city of priests. We could say almost a bedroom community for Jerusalem. So a lot of the people that worked at the temple would have lived in Jericho, and they wanted by any means to remain pure for their work in the temple, and especially on the Sabbath. This is possibly why in the story of the Good Samaritan, 2 of the 3 people that go by the wounded man are priests, probably Sadducees, going on their way to the temple. And one of the beliefs that they had was that Roman money would make them impure if they touched it. And so they didn't want anything to do with it. They didn't even want to touch it ever, not even to change it into Jewish money. And so they would employ people to handle the Roman money for them and change it to Jewish money. And so Zacchaeus would have been a typical person that they employed for that. And because they touched the impure money, they were called sinners. And so you see that's the term that they use in this story. He's gone to be the guest of a sinner. And this person, Zacchaeus, or anybody else in this role, being impure, couldn't go to the temple, couldn't touch his wife, couldn't touch holy things. He was a sinner. Until he was purified, he couldn't do any of those basic things. Now, if there were one person in Jericho whom Jesus could have condemned with the full support of everyone, everybody would have been happy about it, it was Zacchaeus, not only because he was a sinner, but also because he was a tax collector, and not only that, but the chief tax collector, one who collaborated fully with the Romans, and in many cases cheated the people and benefited from cheating everyone. And so again, Zacchaeus is probably not even considered a human in some ways by some of the most religious Jews. Okay, so that's the background for this story, and we don't know exactly what Jesus' plan was when he went to Jericho. We don't know if he was just going through the town on his way to Jerusalem and teaching along the way. We don't know if he planned to stop maybe in a different place. Maybe some of the Pharisees or people in the crowd that may have lived in Jericho wanted to invite Jesus to their house that day and had already maybe prepared part of the meal for him, and we're looking forward to that and having the honor of having Jesus in their house. But what we see in this story is that as Jesus reaches where Zacchaeus is in the tree, then he changes everybody's plans for the day, and including Zacchaeus, and says, I want to go to your house today. Kind of interesting that since Zacchaeus couldn't go to God's house, that God went to his house, and that's what happened. And if you look at that, if you look later on in the story, when after Zacchaeus has made his declaration, Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house. And if you remember, in Hebrew, the word for Jesus, Yeshua, is derived from the word for salvation. And so in two ways, salvation came to that house. Jesus came to his house, and actual salvation came to his house as well. Okay? And you kind of wonder if it isn't symbolic of the entire mission of Christ, that he comes from the house of God in heaven to come into man's house, the world, and to bring them Yeshua, to bring them salvation in every way. And so Zacchaeus is changed, and he makes this declaration. And I've always had trouble making the math work on this because he's going to give away half his possessions to the poor, and then he's going to pay four times more back if he's cheated anyone out of anything. And so the only thing I can think of that makes sense on that, if he's cheated everybody, he wouldn't have enough money to pay 4 times back to everybody because he'd only have the amount he cheated them out of, right? And so you think he must have been honest at least some of the time, and maybe if he did cheat occasional people, then he could pay those back 4 times the amount out of the half that's left to him. So that may make Zacchaeus a little bit better person than we thought. Maybe he didn't cheat just everybody. But I want to focus especially at the end of this class on the last verse of the story, verse 10, for the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Okay? Now, we've talked about how rabbis would use the concept of remez to teach certain ideas. And remez, if you remember, is a hint or a clue, kind of an allusion. And Jesus would often use this, and so did other rabbis. He would quote this part of a passage from the Old Testament, for example, and then he would let the audience supply all the context around that passage. And often we see Jesus saying just a little snippet of a passage, and then the people remember it, and then they react according to the context. And if we don't know the context of it, we don't understand why the people reacted the way they did. Jesus says this much, and it doesn't seem that bad, and all of a sudden people get mad at him. You think, why did they get mad at that? It's because they saw the context. And this is one of those cases where Jesus quotes just a small piece out of Ezekiel 34, verse 16. The Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. The actual part is to seek and to save the lost. That's a quote, right? And so the people listening there supply the rest of the context of Ezekiel 34, and although it doesn't say it afterwards, they get upset, okay? Because Jesus is actually saying three different things with this remez. Okay, let's go back and look at the context then in Ezekiel. Whenever you have one of these remezes, or whenever you see a quote from the Old Testament that Jesus is doing, always go back and look it up. Don't ever skip on ahead. Always go back and look it up. Because in this case, for example, it teaches a surprising amount about Luke 19, if you understand the context of Ezekiel 34. Now in Ezekiel 34, the Lord is saying through Ezekiel that he should prophesy against the shepherds of Israel, verse 2. Say to them, this is what the Lord says, woe to you shepherds of Israel, who only take care of yourselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? And then he talks about how they have abused their role, and they take the best of the flock for themselves, but then don't care for the flock. In fact, expose the flock to dangers. Okay. Verse 4, you have not strengthened the weak, or healed the sick, or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays, or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally. So they were scattered because there was no shepherd. And when they were scattered, they became food for all the wild animals. My sheep, and this is God talking, my sheep wandered over all the mountains and on every high hill. They were scattered over the whole earth, and no one searched or looked for them. Kind of reminds you of Luke 15, where the shepherd actually goes out and looks. Okay. Therefore, verse 7, you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord, because my flock lacks a shepherd, and so has been plundered and become food for the wild animals, etc., etc. Hear the word of the Lord. I am against the shepherds, verse 10, and will hold them accountable for my flock. I will remove them from tending the flock, so the shepherds can no longer feed themselves. I will rescue my flock from their mouths, and it will no longer be food for them. Okay, look at verse 11. This is what the sovereign Lord says. I myself will search for my sheep and look after them. Okay, and he goes on and talks about that for a while. Verse 13, I'll bring them out from the nations, gather them from the countries, bring them back into their own land, pasture them on the mountains of Israel. And then verse 16, I will search for the lost and bring back the strays. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak, but the sleek and the strong I will destroy. I will shepherd the flock with justice. All right, so that's a big context for this. And if you're a Jew and you know your Old Testament, which they did, then when Jesus says this in verse 16, I will search for the lost and bring back the strays, okay? Jesus is saying three things by remez, okay? First of all, this changes Jesus in that setting from just a good teacher that's popular to God. He's saying, I myself will do this. He's saying, I'm God. Because this is the role of God. When there's bad shepherds, then God deposes the bad shepherds, and then God steps in and he becomes the good shepherd. And in John 10, we see he calls himself the good shepherd. He's calling himself a God in that particular context. Okay, so the people that are listening, the Jews, don't like that at all, because they would think that was blasphemy, that Jesus is not God. The second remez out of this passage is that the Pharisees here, who normally are respected as good religious leaders and they're comfortable in their role and they benefit from their role, all of a sudden, if you look at them in the context of Ezekiel 34, then Jesus is suggesting that they have been like the evil shepherds of that chapter, that they don't care for the flock. They benefit from the flock, but then they don't care for the flock, and then they expose the flock to dangers. And so they will be discarded by God, and God himself will take over their role. And so the people that are listening to this, that are the leaders, the Pharisees, they're saying, what, are you saying that we're the bad shepherds like Ezekiel? You're saying that we're going to be discarded by God, and who's going to take over you? And Jesus says, yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. You have not done what you should have done. All the sinners like Zacchaeus, that you have, marginalized and cast out, all the people that were being criticized in Luke 15, all the people that are lost, the people that you grumble about and you call them sinners, those are the ones you should be going after, and you're not. So yes, you are bad shepherds, and yes, I am God, and I will take care of them. And so then the third remez, which should be obvious by now, is that Zacchaeus changes from a lost, despised person in that community to a son of God, to a sheep that God thinks is valuable enough to go after, rescue, and bring back to the flock, and then restore as a member of the flock. So the Pharisees don't like any of this teaching. All three remezes about Jesus and them and Zacchaeus completely turn upside down what they think about themselves, and yet Jesus is telling the truth. And so I wonder if, we can look at this story and see where we are in the story. We can probably identify a little bit with Zacchaeus because we can think of things that we've done wrong that we'd like to make a declaration about and change. But then we can also see how we may have been too comfortable in a position of being accepted in the church and maybe leaders in the church, and maybe missing opportunities to go after people that need us. And then perhaps we've been also Jesus to people, that we've seen their problems and we've gone after, we've had compassion, and we've helped and brought someone back to the flock. So this is a great story, a lot in a few short verses. Hope this has been helpful to you. God bless you. Bye-bye.